Well, it seems like we're finally starting to settle into this new reality of the Wu flu. Things, were very scary there because there was a lot of uncertainty about how the U.S. government was going to respond when things hit the fan, as they now have. And a lot of us on the internet here were very concerned that the U.S. was going to pursue a national lockdown, which I've discussed, ad nauseum at this point. But today, and throughout this last couple of weeks, it's become increasingly clear that there are going to be lockdowns in the U.S., but they're going to be much more like it was in China, to where they're spread out. And so we're seeing now increasingly that local authorities and state authorities are tightening their grip on their people and locking their communities down. But thankfully, even though this is not good, this is terrible for civil liberties, at least it's not a federal lockdown, which would be something much worse. So today, we've got a bunch of new places. We've got Virginia, Maryland, and Florida introducing lockdown measures. Now, Florida's been very, very lax on all this stuff, which, again, I live here, so I'm happy about that because I don't want my personal freedoms restricted. They are still, as far as the major places where this is going on, one of the more lax states. The governor here has been very, very reluctant to crack down at all. It was just over this past weekend that the Surgeon General of Florida put out an advisory saying, hey, if you're over 65, stay home, and that's for the entire state. Then today, the governor came out and said, hey, if you live in South Florida, which is, the three counties that are being hit the hardest here from the whole Wu flu thing, the three counties where there are, by the way, the most contact with New Yorkers, Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach. If you're from that area, you're kind of a de facto New Yorker at this point. I guess from an epidemiological standpoint, because you will have had as much exposure to those people as anyone probably, other than folks actually still in New York City. The problem of New Yorkers has not gone away. Of course, I was talking about over the weekend that President Trump was floating the possibility of locking down New York. That idea went out the window. It seems as though internal travel restrictions are not going into effect in total, but they are going into effect sort of in a de facto sense. There are technically no restrictions that you can't go to any other state. If you live in one particular state, you are not trapped in, where you are, to my knowledge. I think even with these lockdown orders in most of these states, if you just got in your car and tried to drive away and leave the state, they wouldn't, they couldn't just arrest you and hold you prisoner and say, you can't leave. I believe that in all the states where there's any sort of lockdown, or localities where there's any sort of lockdown, the only thing that they're really arresting you for is if you're going out and interacting with other people. For example, if there was a guy who was throwing a party with like 40 people or something, and everyone at the party didn't get arrested, just the guy who was throwing the party got arrested. But that was a more egregious case. But for the most part, it looks like at this point, if you're just if you're minding your own business and you're laying low and you just sort of get in your car and get the hell out of town, they're not going to mess with you. But when you get to where you're going, if you are, say, a New Yorker trying to get the hell out of Dodge and you go to Rhode Island, they're waiting for you. The National Guard there is trying to catch all the New Yorkers they can and quarantine them for 2 weeks. Florida is doing something similar, except it's a little tougher here since a lot of folks come from New York by plane. And I guess they don't want to, have the National Guard at all the airports, arresting people getting off of a plane from New York. And of course, they don't want to, have checkpoints at all, on all the interstates coming into the state, looking for people with New York plates. So everything in Florida really is advisory at this point. Even the South Florida lockdown, I believe the language is, people in South Florida are urged, to stay at home. This is similar to that early lockdown that we saw in a place like San Francisco, where people were urged to stay at home, but they weren't, it wasn't being enforced through the power of law. Now, there are places where they are enforcing this, such as in Maryland, where the governor, the Republican governor, by the way, I I believe he's an anti-Trump Republican, one of those from 2016. He's one of those weird anomalies in the Northeast. You have these Republicans which wouldn't be a Republican in the other part of the country, but they play this dance to where they end up, very popular amongst Democrats and Republicans within their state. I believe the governor of Massachusetts is kind of similar. But anyway, he's introduced a pretty strict lockdown today. If you leave your house, you get a $5,000 fine and you're going to jail. So this is some pretty authoritarian stuff. This really is a good test to see, what the true character is of all these governors across the country. You see who the wannabe tyrants really are. I think the governor of New Jersey probably is the one who's exposed himself the most as being a closeted authoritarian. Oh, Texas, by the way, I should point out, is another state that's mobilized their National Guard to try and stop people from other states who might be infected, except the state that they're worried about is Louisiana, and I guess they're setting up roadblocks to catch anyone with Louisiana plates coming into Texas. And with all this going on, you would think that, boy, there must be a pretty dire economic outlook for the U.S. I mean, medically, we know we're screwed, at least for now. The Trump's two doctors that he likes to have flank him at every press conference, Birx and Fauci, are now coming out and saying, hey, maybe 200,000 is our best case scenario as far as deaths are concerned. I believe Birx said that today. And remember yesterday when Fauci threw that number out first, that 1 to 200,000 range, I said, well, that's got to be their most optimistic estimate. The possibility and the likelihood that it is, quite worse than that, would seem high to me. And unless this chloroquine drug does turn out to be some kind of miracle cure, which again, the jury's still out on that. I guess it could be true. The likelihood that the numbers are far worse than 200,000, on the death column, it seems pretty high to me. People have been looking at this news report out of Wuhan that, because in China, I think they only claim that maybe like 3,000 or so people died. I think 3,200 is their number. In Wuhan, apparently there was some report that they were distributing 42,000 urns to various families to put their relatives' ashes in, and of course the assumption then is that how did those 42,000 people die? Why did they die all of a sudden? Why did the government go around and have to start distributing urns to all these people? Well, it's probably because those are people who died from the Wu flu but aren't a part of the official count. 42,000 is a much higher number than 3,000, and 3,200, whatever it is the number for the whole of China. 42,000, these urns, is a number that applies strictly to Wuhan. Of course, Wuhan is not only a city that was locked down, where everyone who left their house was wearing a mask, for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, but it was also fumigated with these, giant, I don't know if you'd call them like, ground crop dusters or something like that, but they were these big fogger machines, which I would guess have, are probably agricultural in nature, probably are used for applying pesticides or something like that in fields, I would think, to maybe citrus. But they were used in Wuhan and other cities to try and, disinfect, the entire outside environment. They were running these things every day, with people, only being allowed to leave their house every couple days. And so the idea that in that environment that they still ended up with 42,000 deaths, which is only like a quarter of the estimate that Birx and Fauci have for the entirety of the United States, which we know is never going to be able to be locked down to the same extent that Wuhan is. I would say that that 200,000, that seems pretty darn optimistic to me. Oh, and by the way, I heard something that was interesting because I was talking about before how there was this surge in people being kicked off of the cell phone rolls in China, and people were using that to think that perhaps that's a proxy for how many people actually died, and that so the possibility was then that millions of people died in China, and therefore they were taken off the cell phone rolls, but they weren't officially counted as in the death count for the Wu flu. Somebody proposed that actually the reason why those people might have been kicked off the cell phone rolls is not necessarily because they're dead, but because they were speaking out about this whole controversy, and they were exposed as dissidents, and their social credit score went down, so they lost the right to have a cell phone. That to me seems like a equally plausible theory. So I just wanted to point that out. Despite all this, though, the stock market has rallied off the lows where it bounced off of 2,200. I guess it was early last week, and we closed today all the way up over 2,600, I believe, which is about a 20% move in total. So obviously a massive leg up for the stock market. And this has been in a period when the news has just continued to get worse and worse. The only thing that you could say that was positive, economically speaking, was the stimulus, which I've explained before is not something that I'm particularly optimistic about. And so keep in mind that the market cap to GDP, which I believe is now at something like 121% using the old pre-virus GDP levels, which is down from 158% at the market peak, but up from the, I believe, 101% that it hit, at the lows when we were at 2,200. Somebody on Twitter, Sven Henrik, pointed out that, the real market cap to GDP right now is actually going to be much higher than that 121%, because even though the market has fallen substantially from the high in which it was at 158.9% or something like that, the GDP now, because of this virus, will have crashed too. So the actual ratio of market cap to GDP has not fallen as much as it appears to have. So with that said, considering that in the last two recessions we got down into that 50% to 75% range of market cap to GDP, do we really think that the bottom of this market crash was 100% market cap to GDP, and that now we're going to see a new bull market when we are well over 100% market cap to GDP, and actually well over the 120 something percent that we think we're at? Because in reality, now that GDP has fallen, we're probably in the 130% market cap to GDP range, which again is still historically overvalued. So if we're just looking at this normally, we're still in the bubble. There's a lot of air left to come out. Even if this were a normal, recession and a normal deleveraging, normal in the sense that that 2000 and 2008 were normal, we would expect to see the stock market continue to plummet from here. So considering that plus the unprecedented dynamics of this whole virus situation, nobody in their right mind should be buying long term in this market. If you're just playing the ups and downs, that's one thing. I understand that. But if people think, okay, it's safe to go out to go outside now, so I'm going to go buy some stocks and pump up, try and reinflate my 401k, your butt's stupid. So that's about all I have to say on that. I don't know how much longer this bear market rally can last. It's only been a few days, but it's been very, very violent upwards, which again is what you would expect in a bear market. So when we get back down to that 2,200 level again, which we will inevitably, I will be interested to say more about the market then, and to pull from the people that at least the technical guys who, again, because that's not my forte, see what levels they're talking about that we could be going from there. I've heard people throw out the 1,800 number quite a bit, which to me seemed very reasonable. I think that would have been equivalent to 75% market cap to GDP back when GDP was wherever it was in January and February. But given all this, given that however much GDP has contracted since then, we might be looking at a much lower target to get to that, that high-end target of 75% market cap to GDP. Perhaps 1,500 is more realistic. I don't know. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.